Yeah, to say that the peace process in South Africa wasn't easy, as you well know, that creating a kind of climate for peace is very hard in South Africa. So it was very hard in South Africa. There was a coming together of different forces. One was a recognition. Um, so the ANC called for the peace process when it called, when it made a statement in Harare around 1986-87. It said that we want a negotiated settlement. The apartheid government realized also at the time, because of the international isolation, the increased resistance of people on the ground in South Africa, and also the change in the geopolitical factors at the time. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1989. All those factors contributed to the kind of conditions required for a negotiated settlement. So the big forces who supported the apartheid regime didn't have a need for South Africa, because they said South Africa was their bulwark, their resistance against the communists, etc. So when the Soviet Union fell, they recognized that they didn't need to support this apartheid government. In fact, there was, because of the campaign, the international campaign to isolate apartheid South Africa, it was more and more difficult for governments to actually continue to support South Africa. So we had those forces, all those forces that combined. Of course, one of the conditions, remember, Nelson Mandela was in jail. We had an ANC which was illegal in South Africa. So they worked internationally to create the isolation of South Africa. But fundamental to their demand was the release of political prisoners. In 1987, the apartheid government recognized that they had to release Nelson Mandela. They offered him conditional freedom. They said, you can have freedom if you go and sit in a farm somewhere in the Transkei and you don't do any politics. And Mandela refused. He said that I cannot, people who are in jail cannot negotiate, because they were saying, no, we can negotiate some kind. And I think they had some kind of a deal which wasn't proper democracy. So Mandela refused the offer. And in 1990, so then ensued a massive campaign for the release of Mandela. And the preconditions, so when we made the call for a negotiated settlement, one of the things and one of the key demands of that process was to call for the release of all political prisoners. In fact, Mandela was the last of the prisoners to be released. Most of them started being released from October 89, and Mandela was released in February 1990. So the vast majority of prisoners who were clearly, freedom fighters were released in that 5-month period. There were thousands of prisoners who were released. So the demand, and as Mandela famously said, that people in jail cannot negotiate. Only free men can negotiate. I think one of the most powerful things in South Africa was, once there was a commitment to create a settlement, there was a view that in the diversity of South Africa lies its strength. South Africa is a very diverse country. If you look at me, my ancestors are of Indian origin. They came here at the turn of the 20th century, around the 1900s, the early 1900s. There are people here. Apartheid divided us as a society. And one of the main things about this negotiated settlement was it recognized the beauty of the diversity of South Africa. And I think Mandela was very crucial to that. He said that for us to get our own humanity, we need to give even the enemy their humanity. So he gave them an opportunity to be better human beings. And I think that the process, that was quite a fundamental shift from normally the transition from a kind of colonial state to a kind of democratic state. So really, that was also his ethos, a recognition that we need to live together, all of us, as a single humanity. Yeah. So in the initial processes, we had what we call talks about talks. So they didn't just go straight from a situation of let's have negotiations. We first had talks about talks. In other words, what is required for us to have a proper negotiated process? So we had talks about talks. And as I said, there were a number of conditions. The one condition was that the release of all political prisoners, an end to all attacks on civilians in South Africa, an attack, like Turkey does, the old apartheid regime also used to attack neighboring countries, and end to all the attacks on neighboring countries. So I think that was the basis. So they said, let's talk about what we need to talk about. What are the preconditions before a negotiation? So we first did the preconditions. And then once, and it wasn't a 1 day or 1 month struggle, it was months of struggle. And then they started, what the apartheid regime tried to do, it also tried to isolate Mandela from the ANC. So what they started doing is they started to talk to him alone, during the time, it's an interesting little story, around, I think, 1986, 87, there was a massive funeral for some of the ANC people who were killed. And in that funeral started a rumor that Mandela had died in prison. And I think the apartheid government put that rumor there because they wanted to test what will the public reaction be if Mandela dies in prison. And the crowd went mad. Fortunately, Archbishop Tutu was at that rally, and he managed to calm people down and said, let us find out the facts. And that's when we determined that actually it was just a rumor. But I think it was the whole apartheid government's test to see what will the public say if Mandela dies in prison. And they recognized it was a dangerous moment. So they had to also worry about the outcome of that, because Mandela was also a bit ill at the time. So I think they just tried to check. So I think that it's really important that the regime has also got to recognize the danger of the continued incarceration, because that's what happened in South Africa. They recognized, look, they couldn't continue to rule because it was, the difference between South Africa and the Turkish situation is that they were, of course, the ANC was the majority of the people of the country. And so they were really worried that there would have been a massive uprising. And so they also knew they couldn't continue to rule in the same way. And that also their own continued existence and peaceful existence couldn't happen if they didn't resolve the question. And so I think there needs to be a level of political maturity and an understanding that war doesn't solve problems. Conducting war against your own people doesn't resolve any situation. And I think from that point of view, and also from the point of view of Mandela being open to a negotiated process and recognizing the value of peace. Because I think before any negotiated process, there needs to be a recognition that peace has its value. Of course, peace without justice is empty peace. But you need to start somewhere, and you need to begin negotiating. And of course, South Africa is a huge advocate of negotiated processes. Well, there are people who are critical, but the reality is that before 1994, I think about, in South Africa, we talk in racial terms because that's how the society was structured. But African people were the most oppressed, So, for example, the inequality of the education system. For every 5 rand that they spend on a white child, they spend 1 rand on an African child's education. So in other words, the education was so unequal that it meant to keep African people oppressed in continuity. I mean, we now have equality in education. I mean, there are wealthy people who send their kids to private schools. But in fact, if you go to a government school, you are given the same level and opportunity in education, which there wasn't. Before 1994, the vast majority of people in rural areas didn't have access to running water. They had to go 1 or 2 kilometers to get water. We now have that. Now the bulk of the country, we do have problems with electricity, but before 1994, the large majority of people didn't have access to electricity. So, for example, inequality was a feature of life. That's number one. That has gone. Number two, what we have now is we have freedom. Freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom to choose who we want. We're having democratic elections at the end of May. We've had 6, this is going to be the 7th democratic elections, and people choose the leaders that they want. Nobody is imposed. We have a proportional system of representation which allows every vote to be counted. I think that's an important advance, the right of human rights and democracy. I think that we have many problems which we must still solve. We have hundreds of years of colonial past, and we have over 70, 80 years of apartheid. And so that to be overcome, we have democracy for 30 years. Now, it's very new. It's a new democracy, and we must evolve it and make it better. That I don't deny. So look, I mean, I think that what we tried to do when we had the negotiations, they didn't finalize the constitution. They finalized constitutional principles. In other words, the old apartheid government wanted guaranteed seats in parliament for whites and all of that. We said, no, this is a system based on equality. It's one person, one vote. We can't grant one group greater rights than the other. So there was a fundamental realization that there needs to be equality. And there was an agreement on the foundational aspects like fundamental human rights, the nature of the state, etc. So those were some of the kind of what we call the interim constitution. When the constitution was drafted, we had a huge public participation program. In other words, I worked for the Constitutional Assembly, and in fact, I assisted with some of the initial public participation processes. And we went to every small town and we asked people to come and participate, men and women and children, whoever were asked. We received 1.8 million submissions about what they wanted the state to look like. And so we did a deep, deep dive into democracy. I think ours was one of the most open processes. There was no negotiation behind closed doors. It all happened in the public domain. So that was the one thing. There was the recognition, the representation in the apartheid parliament. I think that for many years they had one woman member of parliament. When the ANC came to power, they couldn't get it passed that all parties must have, proper representation. But the ANC had decided that at every third name, because, as you know, men dominate politics. And when they looked at the lists, they found that it was mainly men on the list. So they then changed the list of who was going to parliament. And every third person, so 1 in 3, had to be a woman. So they changed the numbers of women in parliament in the last. So the numbers of women increased tremendously in the national parliament. And I mean, at every level, at the provincial level and at the local level. I think in the last election, what they tried to do is every second person, so it's one man, one woman, they tried to change the list at local level for that. So it is an ongoing, none of these things are set in stone. But I mean, I think the numbers of people in the ANC and the numbers of women has become a non-negotiable. For example, one of the things the ANC does in every province that it wins, that the speaker of the parliament must be a woman. And the premier is usually a man, But if the speaker is a man, then the premier is a woman. So what they're doing is they're distributing power at the top echelons in the provinces. We have many women in the cabinet, in the in the executive, at national level. So I think at that level there has been an enhancement. Remember that in South Africa, many women participated in the struggle. They participated and their voices were heard. Even in the negotiating process, when there was negotiations, they needed for every third person from the ANC delegation was a woman. So 30% of the delegation had to be women. So there was a recognition that you need to assert women's voices at every level in society. So I think there has been advances. Of course, there's also drawbacks and people, complaining, etc. But I mean, once you set the tone at the top, people follow. And I think women now in South Africa, Black women in particular, form every level of society. They at every higher level of society, senior leadership positions in organizations, etc. I think that, until the Turkish regime recognizes that a society is enhanced by the diversity of its people, and a recognition of the right of people to have levels of self-determination, to not oppress their own people, not to perpetuate oppression, not to attack Kurdish people in Iraq and Syria, then there's a prospect of a better life for even the Turkish people. Because you see, like you see in Palestine now, what happens is when you become an oppressor, you lose your own human dignity and you can kill and murder without even thinking. So I think that that's one of the most important things about a peace process and a recognition. When Mandela said, when we free our people, we also free our oppressor from being an oppressor. So I think that for me, the example of South Africa is that, why is it not possible? Why is it not possible for the Turkish state to not feel, to kind of undermine the rights of the Kurdish people? So I think that for me, there's a weakness in the way they operate in the state, because it's a state based on oppression and exploitation of people. And, and also a requirement that we need that everybody must be the same. There's no need for everybody to be a Turk who speaks Turkish. You can have Kurdish people who speak their own language, who are allowed their own levels of autonomy, and they can continue to live in a society peacefully. But if you don't recognize that fundamental principle, then you have a point of conflict in a society. I think that, in South Africa, we recognize that, when your oppressor refuses to listen and they refuse to actually accept your calls for a settlement, then you have no option but to engage in armed struggle. And I think that was clear with Nelson Mandela right from the outset. So these are people who are not fighting for no reason. They're fighting for justice, they're fighting for peace, and they're fighting for the rights of their own people. And I think that for me, that is as clear as day. They are both liberation fighters in their own right. Of course, the struggles are slightly different, but they are both they are both leaders of their people. Abdullah Öcalan is a popular leader of the Kurdish people. Nelson Mandela was a popular leader of the South African people. Well, look, of course, one of the things is like Mandela, Öcalan is incarcerated for his views and his ideas of the kind of society he wants. Remember, in South Africa, the notion of a non-racial society where everybody lives side by side in democracy was unthinkable for the apartheid leaders. They just couldn't bear it. He was a terrorist and an agitator and a communist. That's what they called him, And I think that the same, with Öcalan, he's an uncompromising, principled leader of the Kurdish people, and he stood firm for his principles. And for that, they kidnapped him and sent him to jail in an island. Mandela was also on Robben Island, an island removed from the people. There was a view that, people will forget Mandela, and there is a view that people will forget Öcalan. But it's not the case. When a leader of the people is so loved by the people, they miss him even more greatly. So the call and the demand of the people in South Africa and the Kurdish people for the freedom of Öcalan is the same. I think for me, there's so many similarities between the two. There are leaders who are uncompromised. They would not compromise with anybody, they fought for the freedom of Mandela fought for the freedom of his people, even in jail every single day. And Öcalan too faces the huge amount of kind of harm, continues with his commitment to freedom. You see, I think that had the Turkish state had the courage to continue with their process, I think that I'm not sure exactly why they began the process, because they recognized, there's a political recognition that you need to resolve the conflict, and you need to have a peace process, and you need to talk to each other. But I think they didn't have the courage to continue with what was an important process. I think it would have been internal dynamics within the Turkish government. And also, I think that Erdogan didn't have the political courage to do an important thing. When Mandela, for example, started negotiating, there's some people who said, why are you negotiating? We're going to solve this with a barrel of a gun, till the end, until everyone is, till the last person standing. But he recognized that making peace is a courageous step. Talking about peace is a very courageous step. It's easy to say, we'll bomb you. I think Erdogan said yesterday they're continuing their campaign in Iraq and in Syria, etc. Those things are easy. They create kind of false consciousness amongst the people and the society. But it's much harder to explain to your people why peace is important. And if you don't have the courage, and you are political, you don't have political morality, you would stop that process. And for me, I think those are some of the reasons why they didn't continue. Well, I think one of the big things that is needed is also a kind of, if you don't have the apartheid government didn't have it either. But I think that there needs to be political pressure on those people to force them, So I think that there must be both local and international pressure to make sure that these people continue. So I think important campaigns like the release of Öcalan, the call for a negotiating process, the public demand for a peace process is very, very important. And so those kinds of things are fundamental because you see, you can't rely on a person's personal point of view. You need to make sure that the conditions which allow for a successful negotiated process must be pressure. So, for example, in South Africa, during the negotiation process, they killed one of the most senior military leaders of the ANC, and one of the most popular ones. His name was Chris Hani, and we had public protest at the death of Chris Hani. The talk stopped, but we also then began public protest for the continuation of the talks and for an urgent resolution of the question. So the thing is that the public pressure, the international pressure went up. So you need to put political pressure, mass resistance at the ground level, international pressure, and of course, but also that could only happen because Mandela came and he revealed himself to be quite a principled leader on the stage.
You were mentioning the isolation of Nelson Mandela, so the people would forget him. For 27 years, Mandela was in prison, like Abdullah Öcalan is now for 26 years in prison. So what do you think about the conditions of the isolation in which the prison take place?
Yeah. So look, I think one of the things that I think we must recognize that while Mandela, they took him away in the end, they took him away and they put him alone. Mandela did have other political prisoners. They interacted every day. They made them work outside in the sun, but at that time they dealt with the politics. I think that Öcalan's isolation is even worse than that suffered by Mandela, because they've isolated him without any access to lawyers. I think they never stopped Mandela's access to lawyers. Mandela had visits from the International Red Cross. I think there were leaders in Africa, they had this imminent persons group, and they put pressure on the South African government through the Commonwealth to allow visits to Mandela, to make sure that he wasn't ill-treated in prison. And so I think that the conditions that Öcalan faced is infinitely worse than that which Mandela faced. But I mean, being in prison for 24 years on an island without access, Mandela often talked, and other prisoners on Robben Island often talked about how they just missed seeing children or, everyday life. And so I think that it must be infinitely worse for Öcalan than it was for Mandela. Yes, I say an effective campaign. I think I did participate. I am participating in that campaign through the Kurdish Human Rights Action Group in South Africa. And I do think that it's important. A campaign for the release of Öcalan is important. I think what we need to do is to grow the campaign. I think a lot of people have spoken up. I know the Nobel laureates have spoken up for the release of Öcalan. We had a conference in South Africa in November 2 years ago, where we called for the release of Öcalan. Some prominent leaders in South Africa called for the release of Öcalan. But I think what we need is a kind of, the problem is that the media, the kind of mainstream media, won't give you the views. I mean, I think the Kurds are lucky in that they have their own media instruments, but I think that at the international level, there needs to be a bigger public outcry, for the release of Öcalan. Because, and the thing is, and it's a difficult thing, but what we did in the 80s, they tried for us to forget the face of Mandela. So, for example, in South Africa, even a picture of Öcalan was banned. You couldn't have a picture. But we would go out late at night and put posters everywhere, calling for the release of Mandela with his pictures. So in a way, there needs to be some mechanism to make sure that he's visible even to people who are not Kurds. That his presence must be visible within the country. And of course, you can't do that at an open public level, but there needs to be ways in which this can happen. So, and then, of course, the international campaign, taking the matter to the UN. There's a Mandela clause at the United Nations about the treatment of political prisoners, as you know, because the liberation movement took that matter to the UN. And it's hard, it's not easy, but also these are things that have to be done.
Thank you. So what would you say if the physical freedom of Abdullah Öcalan is ensured? What would change on the one hand for the Kurdish, on the other hand for the Turkish people in the Middle East?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think that people with democratic values, people who are really committed. I mean, what you see in the Middle East is an absence of democratic and popular leaders. People who are leaders who are rooted within their own societies. There's a complete lack of that in the Middle East, first of all, and you see it playing out every day in the politics of the Middle East. That's number one. Number two. Society in which, for the Turkish people, as I said, when you emancipate the Kurdish people, when the Kurdish people have freedom, what will happen is that the Turks will also recognize the extent to which their society is controlled by the elite within Turkey, and it will give them further freedom. So, right now they hide all their kind of corruption and elite and so they hide all their corruption. They hide all the fact that the ordinary people are becoming poorer and poorer, while the elite are getting richer and richer. And they hide that through creating a false enemy. There's the Kurds. They're the biggest problem for the Turks. And they divert the interest of ordinary people into a kind of other area. That is why they continue to detain people. That's why they continue to arrest, because it's a distraction from the reality on the ground for ordinary Turkish people. And I think the Turkish people will benefit most if there's a peace process and they are now living in a society which will then have greater democracy. There will be a greater demand for democracy. It will enhance their own lives. I mean, we know how in Turkey the inflation levels are going out of control. The cost of food is much higher. And they're always blaming it to some outside forces, when in fact it's the inefficiency of the regime in place now. Well, look, I don't think that people really know a lot about Öcalan's philosophy, and I think more needs to be done around that. But I think that deeper democracy, kind of a real democracy where people's views and say, and, without kind of being mediated by others, is really an important process in the deepening of democracy. And I think that for us, I often say to people, if there was an opportunity, we would like to take a delegation of women from South Africa and get them to see the reality of how to, how you can practice your democracy in a different way to really truly enhance and deepen democracy. So I think there's a lot we can learn from you and the value of your ideas. But sometimes to see it in practice will really be amazing. So I think that is an important, when things have settled a bit, I think it's really important for us to come and see and learn from, we all learn from each other. It's not like South Africa has got all the answers or whatever. We all must learn and broaden our scope and our horizons. So as I said, you need to increase the international kind of, to advance the international struggle. In other words, create more kind of awareness of the Kurdish question internationally, to make sure that there is great, it's very difficult in Turkey because the government is very repressive and they lock people up endlessly.
Yes.
So it's very hard, but we need to make sure. I was looking at the New Rose Festival the other day. There are hundreds of thousands of people on the beaches here. And I think that, to use those opportunities of mobilized people to actually put political pressure will really be important. So to create public resistance to the Turkish state. And then, of course, the struggle continues in every form, whether it be armed resistance or otherwise. And then I think those things are fundamental to any struggle to actually change the way an oppressive regime treats you. So what from our side in South Africa, we must do more for the Kurdish struggle, and to find like-minded people everywhere. All of us watching horror at what's happening, in Gaza and the deaths of so many people. But nobody, internationally, there is so little movement. And so it's not only the Palestinians, it's also the Kurds, it's also the people in the Sahrawi, And so those struggles also, we need to look at how we can advance struggles in a common cause against all these kind of states which continue unabated in their oppression. And without the women, there's only half a struggle complete. So the women are required to join the struggle and make their voices heard and be part of the change. And for Abdullah Öcalan, I hope that we see you free soon. Release Abdullah Öcalan right now is my message.